Now, I'm going to be holding this mic, and it's not going to be doing anything for you guys, but you can all hear me anyway. So, my name's Chris. I'm here to talk about the audio in Paratopic, and I'm just going to switch back to the presentation here. See if I can get my notes. Beep, 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 beep. That's me. That's my name. Presence and dissonance in audio design. So, again, I don't know if you saw my talk this morning, but I got some fairly literal kind of notes, so I'm going to be looking at the screen quite a lot. Also try to scan the room occasionally because it's charismatic to do that. I'd like to start off again by just thanking Game Happens and the team for the invitation. When looking over the provisional curatorial document, I noticed there was a little appendix with the word keynote next to it attached to this talk. And naturally, I queried that. Madalena said, we thought it would just be nice to add that. We can remove it if you want. I'm like, no. That's fine. I'll do it, no pressure. But I'm flattered, and it's great to be here. And here we are opening the tech track. I guess I declared the tech track open. So you're welcome. Well, this is an audio and technical focus. I hope it's at least interesting to multidisciplinary or solo developers, because everyone has to kind of pay a little bit of attention to what purpose the audio serves in the design. How many of you are audio specialists? One? A little? Getting there? Okay, yeah, cool. So, yeah, a little. So, there's quite a few generalists as well. Just a couple of people coming in. The question I just posed was, any of you guys who just came in audio specialists? Or, yes? Okay. So, let's keep this relevant then for a broad audience. Naturally, I advocate bringing audio onto the project as soon as you can. If you're going to have contractors or anything like that, then getting them involved early on means the audio can kind of feed back into the design process and help with just the overall cohesion of the project. And you can tell your story with sound. It's very powerful, it's very emotive. So the added benefit if you do have contractors is bring them on early is they get excited about the project as well. They might just put a little bit of extra work in. So what is Paratopic? In my talk earlier this morning on mental health, I didn't really discuss my professional background much, so just a quick primer. My degree is in audio engineering rather than anything specific to games. So I started out as a live sound engineer, the quickest way to make money with that specialism, really. Worked a handful of contracts in sound design for installations and theatre. My entry into games came in the form of a tweak by a colleague in around November 2017 who was working on a little game that would become Paratopic. With one other partner, Jess. So we shipped in March 2018 on itch.io, and I can't recommend itch enough to you guys. I mean, some of you will already have stuff on there, and you know what I'm talking about. It's an awesome little environment. People are on there looking for small, independent, experimental type titles, and people can pay whatever they want. You set the minimum price, and I'd recommend humbly that if you're thinking of hosting on itch.io, charge. Put a minimum charge in there, ask for some money, because it's worth it. If you've put time into it, if you care about the product, do actually ask for just a little something back, and people will pay it. If it costs as much as a coffee, and you put more than a few hours into it, then it makes sense, doesn't it? So Paratopic started out in concept as a walking simulator, making use of more and different verbs than you might expect. We wanted to make a tactile and immersive space. We also wanted the feeling of a kind of surrealism while remaining grounded in an all too mundane context. The player controls 3 different characters. We switch between them in jump cuts. It isn't immediately obvious, perhaps, which one you are at any given time. So they each have a sort of totemic object that's associated with them. You have to use the context to figure out who they are and how their stories intertwine. It's also not necessarily told chronologically. So we're most commonly compared to the filmic works of David Lynch, Cronenberg, etc. So the short version is it's an atmospheric walking simulator with some intriguing interactions, which evokes the feeling of something like a fever dream in a grimy, stained version of the Rust Belt of America. It is on demo downstairs if any of you have played it and want to check it out. It takes about 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. I'm going to be talking about how I leverage the audio to engender presence, which is a feeling of very concrete and effective grounding within the somewhat believable world, and dissonance, the feeling that despite appearances, things are definitely not quite right. So to get into that detail, I'm first going to talk about diegesis. So what is diegesis? If I say, what's diegesis in the context of games, how many of you know what I'm talking about? Yeah? Okay, well, if that was closer to 100%, then I might skip this slide. That's fine, because I animated it and everything. Dictionary definitions aren't that important, but I'm just going to put this up for completeness. The word is from the Greek, diegesis, meaning the act of narration, a narrative, or a statement of a case. And modern definitions begin with the telling of a story by a narrator who summarizes events and plot and comments on the conversations, thoughts, etc. of the characters. And for our purposes, I'm using the second definition here, the sphere or world in which these narrated events and other elements occur. So I also tend to think of it as the narrative space or the game space. I'm trying to think whether I included this slide with all of the fancy illustration on it. I suspect I didn't, and that's fine. To illustrate this, I just say imagine a theatre where one of the props on stage falls over with a clatter and rolls out into the audience, into the lap of someone on the front row. They and the rest of the audience may well find themselves looking around, waiting for a cue, waiting for the actors to react, to tell them whether or not that was supposed to happen, whether this is part of the diegetic space or not, because there's this kind of unspoken pact that happens between actors and audience, between game designers and players, where you mostly have to rely on contextual cues and convention to know whether something is actually intentional or if it's a bug, which happens quite a lot, as you all know, or something else is going on. So what happens if, when that prop rolls out into the audience, the actors just kind of look at each other and then carry on? Dissonance. We know that something isn't quite right, and it's a little uncomfortable, and suddenly that unlucky audience member has to deal with this. So we have these two categories. We have diegetic elements, footsteps, gunshots, characters speaking, music playing from a radio, all of the stuff which is happening inside the narrative space and that the characters themselves would be able to hear, be aware of, that it's pertinent to the story, to the environment, to the design. And we also have the non-diegetic elements, which may include music playing over the menu, user interface audio, GUI, and the bugs, anything that's not supposed to be there, something leaking in from another part of the world. There's also a third way, something that exists kind of between those two categories. And this contains everything which is not neatly defined into one or other of these cases. And gameplay music, for example, is not always non-diegetic. Sometimes an environment has music blasting in a club, for example, or during a shootout. But it's not necessarily clear initially whether that's supposed to be happening in the game space or not. All of this stuff up top was a little too clear for our purposes in Paratopic. We wanted to confuse things a little bit more. We wanted the player off balance, basically. In truth, any of these elements can live within that netherworld of uncertain narrative pertinence. So, for example, Dead Space. Outside of its core functional menus for saving, loading, and settings, Dead Space series used a fully diegetic user interface, where the character, Isaac, reacted to and used the in-game menus in tandem with the player. Your actions are supposed to reflect Isaac's, as his head tracked with your changing selections on the HUD. It rotated and moved with the player character as he walked around the environment. It's a projection made by his suit. This immersive technique adds what I would term presence for the player and engrosses you in the world. This is desirable because Dead Space is a horror game, which thrives on conveying a persistent threat. So the more anchored that a player feels to the character and the world, then the more effective the protagonist's physical presence will be for them. And the threats to the character will be more effective threats to the player. So that's why it's really beneficial in this particular case. And what we want when we talk about immersion is to foster that connection through the screen, basically, to break that fourth wall that you have in the theatre, get the person on the outside relating to the person on the inside. But the first time you bring up this menu, it might not be immediately clear that the game is continuing as you browse. It might not be obvious that it's something Isaac sees too. And how do we find out? Like with the actors on the stage, we pay attention to him. We ask for his cues. He uses that he sees it as well when he reacts to its presence, when he looks around. And it's consistent with the other holographic displays as soup producers for video calls, audio logs, a 3D map, waypoint guidance. So yeah, talk about game audio already. I have been talking about game audio because the soundscape design for Paratopic began way before I set the first instructions down in the production software. It's really important to think about your goals and intent and what you want from the soundscape right from the start, because every part of the process and the production, the implementation, the mixdown, all of that is dependent on the actual purposes. Thankfully, from the first time I saw a work-in-progress screenshot of Paratopic's visuals produced by the excellent Jess Harvey of Tangier's infamy, I would say, the game communicated its goals quite well. This is a grimy, nicotine-stained world of weird people and weirder occurrences. Paratopia is not a comfortable place to be. It's somewhere between a neutral dream and a nightmare. It became clear quite quickly that we had a twofold goal when it came to presence and distance in Paratopic. Firstly, we wanted to connect the player to the player character, or more accurately, player characters, plural. Secondly, we wanted to create an artificial distance between the player and the non-player characters. This is a world where everyone mistrusts one another, and rightly so. It's dangerous. So this allows the environment and story to do its work and creates a feeling that what's seen cannot be trusted. That's in line with the cinematic format and presentation. The distance between the character and the player character and the NPCs is on some level physical, and some of the work there was of course down to the art. The models and textures sit in that uncanny valley kind of thing. They're clearly not real people, at least not since Tomb Raider, but they have the faces of real people. You're left with a little disbelief at what you're looking at. The distance also needed to be conceptual, so here the writing by Doc placed a lot of suspicion and intrigue into the dialogues. And you're never quite sure whether you've met this individual before, and they're not always clear about it themselves either. So really though, audio. We're in dark mode now, by the way. So there are several major pillars of the soundscape in totality for Paratopic. We'll cover each of these in more detail separately. Firstly, the music had to be appropriate to each area, some of which are revisited in different contexts, and that had to lead the player's emotions for each scene, basically, implying the tone of the environment. Sound design and sound effects. Obviously, sound design is a vital part of feedback for the player, to let them know that the things they're doing are having effects in the world. The coincidence of a sound effect along with a visual change resulting from player input gives them feedback loop, which is one of the more satisfying aspects of playing games as opposed to just watching films or reading a book. Dialogue and voice acting. Voice acting. Come back to that. We knew we wanted the character to speak. We didn't have the money to pay any voice talent. We wanted to create a feeling of distance between the player and the NPCs, as I talked about before, and we wanted to make that distance felt that nobody was there to help you. I found a solution which worked for us, I think. We've got the blended diegesis, which basically this is where the rubber kind of meets the road for these concepts. We wanted to carry the consistent tone of uncertainty and surreality from the game's overall design through to the audio. This world had to conceivably be a dream, but one that you can wake up from. So we're kind of mixing things around, not making it clear what's inside and outside, and that applies to all of the other parts. It's that holistic design again. So beginning with music. In this slide I'm going to make an attempt at playing some sound. I think it's actually only going to come through laptop speakers, but it'll do the job, I suppose. the art can only really go so far in telling its story. Silence is a specific design choice, especially with regard to horror. We did use absence of music, primarily in the gas station, and in the car if you leave the radio off, but that's not a default position. A default position is to include a soundtrack, because people expect to hear music. Silence isn't neutral. Silence is ambiguous. And as it happens, a lot of the music in Paratopic is also ambiguous. One good example is the music which plays in the apartments. It might tell you something that if I say that in preparing for this talk, when I went to source these audio assets, I found this piece of music in the sound design folder, not in the music folder. The file itself is called Apartments FX V4 Slow, reflecting a change in the tempo I made after producing most of the texture. And it's also split into layers. So when you first enter the apartments and arrive in the room that you see on the screen, you hear an ambient bed track. And that's immediately following the short title sequence, which itself is very noisy. So we have this kind of crescendo on the title card, and then we drop into this ambience. So let's see if I can just get that running here. So this is primarily a grain table synthesis for any of you sort of into synth. So yeah, there's obviously a few nods. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So grain table synth with input from another fairly dark sounding synth pad. It's then processed to give a fairly wideband noisy effect, which is then played like a keyboard. So there's one root note which gives it the kind of muddy and wide bed track. The stereo obviously doesn't really carry, but play the game. And then if you listen carefully, there are other overtones on top of it. And this ambience is an identical length to the music and melodic track itself, because they were produced and designed to play together. They're from the same session, just exported separately. So this ambience plays until you hit the elevator button. I've never had the opportunity to just go there. And then the ambience drops out. There's a nice kind of chunky click from the button, and the melodic track starts to play on top. The ambience is restarted and played underneath the second layer, which is the chords, additional metallic sounds, the creeping bass line, the lead, the arpeggiator later on. Here it is without the ambience. This was the first piece I wrote when I was beginning to kind of develop the sonic palette, which I'd then extend to the rest of the game. In order to get a feel for what sound we wanted in here, I asked Jess where this location actually was in the world. Was it originally residential? Is it deep in the urban space or somewhere else? We settled that in keeping with the theme of Dissonance, the apartments building itself actually resides within kind of a dilapidated industrial district. Kind of rusted out and abandoned, and would have originally probably been worker housing or maybe some other kind of building, because this lobby space is actually like stupidly tall. It's got these kind of pillar effects of, I don't know, could be the lobby for a bank. It's also not even clear, I don't know any more than you do what's behind the door that you came in through. Could be the street, could be something else. So the lobby is a liminal space, basically. It's a transitionary space. Most of the spaces in Paratopic are liminal. it's a liminal space within a liminal space within a liminal space, and this led to the choice of the metallic overtones which you hear in the soundtrack, trying to evoke that industrial surround and making you question perhaps whether that's actually happening or just something in your head. So that's an example of our diegetic blending, basically. For dissonance, it's just not immediately obvious whether it's part of the soundtrack or actually happening somewhere in the building, and that's deliberate. So this track combined with the ambience would eventually be titled Urban Dreamscape on the OST. I could talk about the music for a long time. We don't really have a long time. So I'm going to move on to sound design. SFX. It's perfect. Actually having it running in a separate program is great. It makes me look really smooth. So this aspect, specifically when it comes to the interactive elements in the environment, such as a gun, such as the camera, such as a tape case, needed to reinforce the physicality of the objects. In fact, your relationship to the objects you use may be one of the least obfuscated elements in the game. It's really direct. So as I said, each character, and there are 3, has a relationship with a totemic object. And that relationship's key to the story and piecing together their identities. So for the interactives in this game, we wanted to hark back to kind of the late 90s, which the graphical style obviously is reminiscent of. A lot of people said it is PS1, and in fairness, one of the plugins that Jesse used is called like PSX Shader. But but really, when we were growing up, played a lot more PC games. So like one of the reference points for Jess that's massive is Terminator Future Shock. If you ever played that, myself, I'm like, my favorite game's Unreal. So it's that kind of vibe. Deus Ex as well. And they had a particular kind of character to sound design at that period as well, when memory budgets for audio were quite limited because of RAM requirements and just the media that they were distributed on to get it on a floppy disk or whatever needs to be quite tight, short, heavily compressed digital stuff, leading to the kind of digital artifacting you get, which I call crunchiness. And this is particularly audible when listening to the layers on the elevator itself as it's descending, especially when it hits the ground. It's also audible in this scene in the diner. We have a couple of objects on the table in front of us. The only one we can initially interact with is the gun. We also use this as a tutorial moment, by the way. So if players don't grab the gun in, I think it's 10 or 15 seconds or something, we kind of fade in a little help message to nudge them along. Because Jess is great, I think we should manage to get that to adapt to whatever input method they're using. You can't walk around yet, so the player's still rooted to the spot. By this point, I don't think they've had free control, just camera movement. So a camera movement and dialogue choices. So the gun grab itself is actually fairly untreated. I won't go into my Foley process in depth, but it's a couple of handling sounds on some objects around the studio. We've got an initial swipe sound followed by a mechanical clicking as the cylinder swings out ready to be loaded. So just a quick little sound here. That's it. That's the 2 pieces. Play that again. I'll be switching back a few times on this slide. So both of these sounds are simple and hard to mistake for anything else in the environment. They're also largely unfiltered, meaning they're using the full frequency range of the constituent sounds, and their dynamic range is compressed so they pop out of the scene. In contrast, the music is quite muddy, it's slow, it's droning. Nothing moves as fast in the soundtrack as it does when you're dealing with interactable objects. So this is where we start to feel our presence in the space and our relationship to the objects which define our characters. So the gun then sits in the corner of the player's view, just kind of in the bottom right corner, with the cylinder hanging open. And they're now able to pick up the bullets. So these really just use a little plink. That's quiet. That's very quiet. That's it. It's a plink, but it's a loud plink. And it starts loud and it ends loud, and it's very present between 5 and 10 kilohertz, which is a pretty shrill tonal range. For reference, the most ear-splitting sounds tend to be in the kind of like 2 to 4 kilohertz range, which is actually the resonant frequency of the ear canal generally. So like babies screaming have nice overtones around that. Guitars. For those of you who aren't in audio, the human hearing range runs from around 20 hertz, and then theoretically to an upper boundary of 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz. A few years of drumming, a few years of live audio engineering. My upper range isn't 20 kilohertz. Wear earplugs, guys, okay? It matters. I'm still just about on the boundary where I think if I reference properly and use analyzers when I'm mixing it, it isn't yet prohibitive. I'm not sure when I get older if that will still be true. I don't know. Tinnitus sucks. So we then slide the bullets into the chambers one at a time. Thanks. And this is going to be similarly chunky and crunchy, maybe a little bit of bit crush on there somewhere in the production. And that little click at the end is the cylinder just moving around to the next one. This, again, I got to credit Jess with just really cool interactable with this. The animations are really cool. And then when all the chambers are loaded, we swing the cylinder shut and we cock the hammer. And one other tiny sound that I was quite happy with in the game is actually the lamp switch when you reach your apartment. I mentioned Deus Ex earlier. This comes directly from that because there's like desk lamps in a few places. And all that happens when you interact with it is like the texture changes so that the switch looks darker on one side than the other. But it also makes this really satisfying just clunk. Which just, I don't know, it feels nice. So that's it. That's like, it doesn't really sound like any table lamp in the universe, but it does the job for me. That's all. I think I play it back at a higher pitch when you switch it on, so it's like clock clock. For this, I talked about Deus Ex. God, why can't my notes keep up with me? Okay, so dialogue / voice acting. Every non-player character in this game has a voice, with the exception given to one of my guests on the radio. All of them are me. And this is really the nexus of our dissonance, and it's the thing that people comment on the most, aside from, it's like either this or the music. I did a fairly lengthy thread on Twitter about it late last year. I'll retweet that today if I can find it. The production was essentially a process of like making gibberish syllables and words onto a recorded track, and then writing those down phonetically. I'd then make an attempt at doubling them up on a second track. So I'd try and do the same thing again, and hopefully fail. From there, it was all heavy editing and layering. So I'd cut segments out, flip them around, pitch them up and down, run them through effects chains for resolution or heavy distortion or clipping compression, and then add up the layers underneath, which is, it runs kind of like as a sort of counter rhythm, or generally added a more menacing undertone, so like a kind of like groan or a growl or something. And the result, which obviously I'm happy with, is that our characters all sound completely messed up. Like several people are speaking at once and they're not saying anything comprehensible. That's deliberate as well, because a lot of them have ulterior motives. Most of the people you speak to, I think gas station guy's probably an all right dude, on balance, unless he's in league, with the aliens. He's gonna rule the corner. So this is, we call him Shifty. It's called card game dialogue because initially you were supposed to be like having some kind of poker game with him at the table, but this guy seems to be blackmailing you somehow. So you're moving these tapes across the border. He's giving you instructions. And, actually, the diner scene we saw beforehand, you were sat in the far booth in that back corner. And the diner became a little bit of a hub. no one else is listening, right? It's just you and me. So I'll just share, like, they're definitely two different characters. A lot of people have figured it out. I mean, it's obvious they were supposed to, and it says that on the Steam page, but it doesn't stop people from speculating. And someone even told me, like, no, I don't think they're called assassin. I think it's more like, gunman. Okay, yeah, whatever you say, man. So one of my inspirations for getting the language right are a couple of short videos emulating what spoken English sounds like to people who don't actually speak the language. I'm just going to play another one here. One of those videos is called Squirrel. Again, actually, yeah, I'll put these on Twitter as well. And the other one is actually from Bella Italia. It's a parody song written in 1972. Now, the pronunciations here, not just the Italian, but this other thing that's coming up. I'm going to try and just clap if I get it right. He's teaching a class of American-looking kids about a subject called Braisenkollinensinanchuso, which is not a real thing. But the whole kind of song is based around this, like, call and response between him and the rest of the class, where they just speak gibberish at each other, but it's supposed to sound like American English. So I had a lot of fun with it, as you can probably tell. This last one is a good example of the additional layer being used to give this ambiguous impression of what the character's really saying. And this time he's kind of laughing at you. So the other place where we have a lot of dialogue happening is actually in the car. The car is, I won't say controversial, but not even divisive. A lot of people got it. A lot of people enjoyed the feeling of just taking a road trip at night and could relate to that, particularly people who, we got a lot of comments from people who live like in the kind of Rust Belt of America or just anywhere with long, long highways that stretch on forever. They're like, yeah, that feels like being home. Some people just look around the cabin in the car and like, what am I supposed to do? What am I doing? Where am I supposed to go? How do I move it on? And like, fair enough. Part of the design is to try and be a little bit antagonistic to that way of thinking. Actually, one of the streams we got quite early on was some of the Yogscast guys. I can't remember who it was, but there were two of them. And this one stuck out to me because they kind of went through the dialogue early on, and then they got to the apartments, having kicked the door down in the diner, arriving in that lobby area, and then like immediately, like a dog out of the trap, he went straight and made a beeline for the elevator button. Bang! And then turned straight around and went and throbbed the cigarette in the ashtray as well. Just like, it was a really actually impressive display of gamer sense. I'm just like, I can tell that's interactive. I can tell that's interactive. And he hit them both. And then he started walking into the elevator door, just like, I must be missing something. Click, 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 click. And turning around. And then he stopped. And he went, huh. Yeah, no, that's just me. That's just how I play games. But it's trying to slow me down, so I'm actually going to just calm it and get with their pace. And I'm like, the scene did its job. That was good. I really liked that. So anyway, that's a little diversion. But so in the car, anyway, you've got the option to play like a weird talk radio station. The other option is music, which is just arrangements I made of some classical pieces on Moog and other synths. It's on the soundtrack, that stuff's named Carlos FM, after Wendy Carlos, who was a composer of, well, not composer, like arranger for Switched On Bach and Clockwork Orange, among other things. Just pioneer of that stuff. Really, really cool. So here's the talk radio.
But you call wall the pulse. It's not called calm water. So calm water.
And I've got the extreme.
Yeah.
I've got it.
Oh, God, just blow your arms, man.
Tell me.
So this is my friend and I, Baron. What a dude. He lives in Prague actually, but he came over occasionally during development and would see it at different stages. He was actually there on the day we shipped as well and watched those first streams with me where we saw someone like crouch in the woods and managed to walk straight through the floor and just see under the world, and I'm watching it live. Jess! Jess! Collision. We ran that test so many times. We caught all of the tree stumps, but not the floor behind the boxes. So, but like initially, Doc actually sent me a script for, what's his name? Art Bell, who is a talk radio host in the US, and he does like conspiracy stuff. So people call in about Area 51 or moon landings were faked, or there's Martians in my cereal, or like exploding squirrels, or it's like the real version of Chatterbox FM. And so there was an interview with a Stephen Greer. I still to this day don't know what Greer does, but ostensibly that's the guy I'm talking to on this show. We tried turning that actual script into gibberish live. So like I just set up the 3 mics with the two of us and like let's read through this. But it turns out that actually reading the stuff on the page, converting it to gibberish in your head, but with syllables that still match the pacing of the actual text, saying it and doing that at a conversational pace is more or less impossible. I mean, try it. It's just too much. So what we did in the end was I penned some questions on a little bit of paper, turned the chairs to face each other, and then we just did an impromptu podcast where instead of reading a script, I would ask him questions. And he'd go, and we just do like body language and did this whole thing. There's like half an hour or 40 minutes of that material. And Jess wanted to make the driving that long. I did talk her down from that. We compromised on about 9 minutes total across 3 sections. And that's fine. So the effect of the dialogue really is to catch the part of the brain that's listening for comprehensible speech, make it think that there's some real language going on there, because occasionally there are like little snippets that come through, like seemingly just, I think he says like, the terrorists at the end of that piece I just played. So you get this bit of the brain engaged trying to decipher it, and it gets a little bit frustrating. It's kind of like scratching at the side of your head, just like, it almost makes some kind of sense. And this, we believe, successfully created a low-level sort of discomfort in players as they traveled through our world, meeting these creepy-ass denizens. So, a little bit on the implementation now. This was built in Unity. We used the default audio tools for everything. We used Fmod for Roman Sounds, which we just shipped on Humble. And that was kind of a revelation, but actually the Unity tools are pretty all right. Spatialization is one of the things I wanted to talk about. So how many of you know what I'm talking about when I say like a spatialized sound? Yeah, okay. So we've got 2 options when we want to play a sound inside a game space. If you create an audio source in Unity, it has coordinates regardless. That game object has to exist in order to play just level music. But there's a setting in, I think I've got a screenshot of the actual panel, in the inspector, where it can either be a 3D sound, spatialized, or 2D, meaning it plays just in both stereo or the whole mix. If you've got 5.1 or something, it's just flat, it's playing everywhere. So if you've got like level music, that's 2D, non-spatialized. But if you've got birds chirping in a tree or some frob that you need the sound to be attached to, the player can kind of walk around it and tell based on the difference between their ears where the thing is located, then it's spatialized. So one of the things this does is it cues the player for diegesis. It shows them what's real in the space and what's not. And we, for shorthand, kind of call the spatialized sounds 3D. Crucial for interactives, like I said. And it's useful for environmental sounds which blend with 2D ambience, which is one of the things I did. So there are a number of examples in Paratopic of sounds which could feasibly be spatialized, but partially out of laziness, partially out of like just genius. Some of them are just printed 2D into the area soundtrack. So one example is the birds from the forest scenes, which, with the notable exception of this shot on the side of the road, are included in the music track rather than being placed discreetly around a 3D space. Because if you do that, then you've got to juggle how far away they're all audible. I mean, I should clarify, when the birds take off from the trees, there's a little wing flapping sound that plays. That is spatialized. But the ambience of just crows and birds and wind, all of that's printed with the music. Because it's supposed to just be all around you at any time. And because we're transitioning soundtracks as we move between areas, then it didn't really need to be spatially limited. One thing we did do on Birdwatch B, which is the second section with the shack and stuff, was just set up some zones. I can't think if they were colliders or I think it was coordinates. I think she did it on the back end, just to bring different layers of the soundtrack in and out as you walk around the space. So as you get closer to the cliff face, you get less. Well, eventually the pads disappear and you're just left with the bass line. Similarly, if you go anywhere else in that level, downwards, for example, then I switch to another soundtrack, which was produced in the same session when we did the updates for Steam, with the same bass line. But that's one of the downsides of the Unity tools, is you can't really do those kinds of crossfades easily. I had to lean on the programmer to do that. So this is where middleware comes in. Things like Fmod and Wise. I actually think the Birdwatch A with the car is one of my favorite scenes in the game. There's just something about it. I mean, you can, those of you who haven't played it, you can just about make out there's like a telegraph pole in the background here. Once you frob this box in the car, the lights come on and it's daytime. And it's just a piece of the highway that you've pulled along the side of the road. And it's quiet. You can hear a little bit of the wind blowing. Actually, if you walk out of this spotlight too far, then you get reset. And I didn't have a way to dynamically turn the sound sources on and off for the environmental sound. So what I ended up doing was, there's like a sound source up here for one bit of the wind on the road. And it gets more and more intense as you get further to the point at the end of the road. If you walk down it, you get reset again to this center point. Same in that direction. So I've got a wind source over there and a wind source over there. And I just had to keep adjusting the range so that the sphere stopped about there and just left this. So you can still kind of stand there and the scene's absolutely silent even when the lights have come on. But if you go in any direction, then hopefully you start hearing something. I've also got some little birds and a cicada just playing in the little copse over here. And then the final thing that is spatialized is the crows. So I think it's the same sound file that I just baked into the rest of the scene in the next one when you transition. But as you're walking towards the collider that transitions you to the next area, you can kind of hear the birds just starting in the distance, and that is spatialized. Because we want to kind of lead you through and make it feel like there's at least some continuity. So all of this is to say that spatialization and the placement of sources is really important. Be sure you know why you're making the choice that you're making. And use spatialization to help orient the player when you've got more complex environments. Someone was talking yesterday about in VR trying to like find a robot just by listening. And people have different skill levels with this stuff, so just use it as one of the tools in the toolbox. Of course, with numerous different sounds being played in the space, both 2D and 3D, there's a challenge presented in making them all play nicely together. And this is actually one of my favorite parts, I think, is the mix down of the scene. So I've been producing music for a while now. The process is similar, except there's one more dynamic aspect in the mix in games than in recorded music, which is the player's movement and the limited predictability of the confluence of certain sounds. So in other words, you've got X amount of headroom. You can only fill so much of the mix with sound before it starts to distort or cause other problems. And it's also just not intelligible past a certain point. You need to prepare the player to do things that you might not necessarily choose to design for. So you need to bug test and stress test your audio mix, as well as the other parts of your game's integrity. Although I will freely admit that an overcooked audio mix is a little less crucial as a shipping bug than, say, missing gliders on the floor. So you can prioritize. Or maybe that's a feature for you, I don't know. In terms of optimizing the mix for effect, I'll just briefly touch on 4 basic concepts to consider, which I think even people who don't specialize in audio or who don't have a dedicated audio developer on board should at least be aware of, even if you then become hopelessly lost looking for them. Filtering. I put this up front because it's one of the best ways to add realism. And in the micro-indie sphere, I see quite a few titles not actually making use of it. Air absorbs sound. And one of the side effects of the physics of sound pressure waves is that higher frequencies get muffled over distance slightly more than bassy tones. So this can be quite exaggerated over large distances, but it's also very noticeable with stuff with a lot of high range energy, like fire, running water. Where possible, apply a low pass filter, meaning the low frequencies are let through, and have its threshold frequency, the point at which that graph begins to roll off, decrease as you move further away from the sound source. So just to put that in other words, because it's worth knowing conceptually. So you've got the full available frequency range of sound, we talked about it before, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, theoretically. I mean, when you're producing stuff, you need to make use of that range, because some people can hear it. Those just... as you get further away from something, you will hear less and less of that top end. So you just want to adjust the threshold downwards. Now, again, a lot of middleware, and if Unity has this feature as well, have like a built-in attenuation graph. So Unity will, on sound sources, allow you quite easily to draw a graph, and again, I got a screenshot for it, for volume attenuation over distance. But filtering needs to be done separately. So that's a thing. If you have Fmod, then the spatializer unit will, you can, I know you still have to set it up as, I think there used to be one part of the deck like as an effect called like distance filter, and I think you can still use the deprecated version of it. This is Fmod I'm talking about. But otherwise you add a filter and then automate it, right click, add automation, and then use a distance parameter and draw the graph so that it slides down. If that didn't make any sense, but you would like it to make sense, just send me an email. Reverb. Reverb is the natural sound of spaces. I'm not just shouting for no reason, I'm trying to demonstrate a thing. It's a sound with no reverb doesn't sound like it's in a space at all. Not everything needs a lot, but many things need a little. Outside areas with no big, flat, hard surfaces just don't really have a lot of reverb. Maybe they have echo. If there's mountains in the distance, you might have like a delay for the thing coming back, a delay for the thing coming back. But if you're in a concrete tunnel or a bunker, then you need quite a lot more reverb because the sound lasts longer before it decays to zero. So try setting up one reverb bus per area. A bus is just like a reverb. Reverb. Try setting up one reverb bus per area. Like if you're doing that corridor, then give it more reverb. But also, you need to be able to hear the reverb in here. I mean, need is like a strong word, but you need to be able to experience what's happening out there. It does need to carry through in here. So if I was setting up a mix for these two areas, I'd want the sound source of the baby to actually pass into the reverb bus for this zone as well. So that there's a portion of that coming through. The bus is just like another mix channel that you can send sounds to and operate separately and can have its own effects layer. So not you have like the dry sound here, quote unquote, with no effects, and then the bus, which it sends to and then goes to the master separately. So apply the reverb on the bus, and then you can do that for different areas, and you can have the same sounds will be affected differently. Change the bus levels when you move into a collider. I think that makes sense. Anything I haven't covered there? You generally don't want the reverb to be louder than the initial sound. In Unity, you can also use reverb zones if you've got a lot of dynamic spaces. I didn't really mess around with that. In fact, I think the reverb's pretty flat in Paratopic. We did fade in a different reverb for like the bunker. Relative volume. Controlling this is half the battle, or maybe more. Unity's built-in spatializer and 3D sound settings on sound sources is pretty good, like I was talking about before, but Fmods is better. You can use the audio mixer to control the overall levels of various things, and you can submix too. Having that graphical user interface, it has like mixer channels on the audio mixer, is actually something that I don't think Unreal Engine has at this point. It's just numerical values. I mean, get it together. But blueprints are good, so yeah, come see. Frequency content. Just pay attention to what broad frequency range your sounds are in. You don't need to get too scientific about it. But if you've got a very bassy drone or a loud tank engine or something, you're not going to want lots and lots of bass in the sound for the machine gun on top of as well, or the music. So if you've got very, in contrast, bright, toppy, like waves crashing on a beach, or perhaps story significant, acute gunfire, then you may not want lots of high-end instruments and local music as well. Altogether, these elements create the illusion of presence. And this is a cursory look, slightly less cursory than it's actually written on there. But just try to keep these points in mind for your own projects if you end up working without an audio specialist, or if you do. And as I said, if you want specific advice on any of these, then please just ask. There's the screenshots. So this is an audio source game object, and you can see that I'm just trying to cast my mind back now because I've been working on Fmod for like a year. You can adjust the pitch on any given sound. The raw file is added here. This is the mix channel that it goes to on the audio mixer. So like this is the windmill sound from the previous screenshot, which is a source just placed kind of somewhere strategically on the tower. And then you can do stuff with it. Stereo pan would bias it to be, pan or panorama is just the balance between the left-hand side of the stereo channel and the right-hand side. If you're doing a surround sound mix, then you're going to have more than that, but I haven't messed with that yet. I'm not that pro. Spatial blend is a weird one. This is the bit where it's 2D versus 3D, and this one you can see there's a little bit under 1, so it's not completely only audible like positionally. There's a little bit which feeds into both channels whenever you're in its range. I kind of wanted it to have a little bit encompassing. You can end up with the sounds being kind of quite narrow and feeling a little bit hollow if they're completely spatialized. It's right over there and it sounds a bit small. I think you can also increase the spread. If you want to fix that, this will make it like a wider source, so you can kind of walk around it at a wider circumference. This graph here is the attenuation graph for distance. So along the bottom there is the distance in the Unity units, and then that's the relative volume level. So you can set this graph as a custom, but that's just a standard exponential curve. And then you set your max distance there. You can do this live and preview it, and you can see the spheres expanding and contracting if you look in the scene view, but it doesn't save it when you close runtime. So don't forget to do it again. Chris. Okay. So a little bit about game feedback. This was a really nice quote that Jess got from someone, which is kind of exactly what you want to hear as a sound designer or a composer. Hey, I forgot to tell you, but I showed Paratopic to my too young to be playing this 8-year-old son, and he really liked it. We found stuff that I didn't find on my playthrough, like the redacted. I redacted it. He was wearing headphones and found the stairs down to there and tried opening the door to no avail. Then he leaves the redacted and walks away. He takes the headphones off in a flash and hands them to me to play. I heard the door open, he said with wide eyes. That was something I wasn't totally sure if it was going to work, but a quick early play test just with friends and stuff, they did actually hear the thing happening. It didn't open initially. It just in the initial itch release, it just stayed shut, but the door knocked back. And then people wanted to know what was behind the door. If you put Chekhov's door, then it's your own fault if you have to make something behind it. So here's another point on the headphones, actually. Consider carefully the format in which people will be playing your game. So if you're designing for console, it's quite likely to be heard through integrated television speakers, about 60% of the time, maybe more. And as I said, there's not a lot of stereo from that. You just get kind of a flat sound coming at you. Could be interesting if we put some horns on the back of it and cast one over here and one over there. It might work, but so if your game relies on atmosphere, consider making allowances for that. It might be in the shape of a menu option for dynamic range. I've seen that in a few places now. It's getting more common. It's the kind of thing you want to have like an audio engineer look at properly before including it on a whim, so as to just not provide a worse experience overall, because it's not that easy. One game that does this pretty well is Elite Dangerous. They have dynamic range settings for headphones, speakers, what have you, and it just applies different compression and mix variables for that, basically. The other thing is just maybe include a note at the start to say, please wear headphones if you have them. Frictional Games did that with Amnesia, The Dark Descent. I think that was the first time I saw it, actually. It's like, game is best experienced on headphones, and I'm kind of just inclined to do that because I want to have a good time. People just need to be asked sometimes. It just doesn't... audio people, we think about this stuff, but not everyone gets it, So they need to be told. Paratopic is, obviously I would say this, but seriously, Paratopic is notably less effective with suboptimal audio delivery. So consider the vector carefully when you're designing and mixing. Audition your mix on different audio hardware if you can. Audio storytelling is great, but you can't rely on players to have critical listening hardware or wetware. So, in summary, know what your audio needs to achieve. Consider diegesis. Design for presence with mechanics and in tandem with mechanics. Design for dissonance when it suits the mood, and obviously it did for Paratopic. It may not if you're doing something more direct. That was the story we wanted to tell. But whatever you're doing, use a consistent production style. Carry it through as you're making the sound effects. If it's going to be really grainy and crunchy, then do that and keep it that way and accentuate it in the mix. Keep it compressed. But if you have a very cinematic, wide experience, then you want your strings to be dainty and gentle, and you want your drums to be powerful and loud, but just make it consistent. Make conscious decisions vis-a-vis spatialization. Just know why you're using it and when. Use filters, use distance attenuation, use reverb. They're all there in Unity. You can add plugins to the mixer channels, reverb, low pass filter, and a bunch of other crazy stuff, phasers and so. Ridiculous. And listen to your mix and consider in what ways your audience will be listening as well. Yeah, if you want to get a photo. I think that's it. Thank you very much.